Malaysia prides itself on being that of a multicultural nation within Southeast Asia, as coming from diverse origins as well as the people living within the country are a unique and harmonious blend of cultures, peoples, beliefs, and customs. But what not many don't know who live outside of Malaysia are the details of how exactly the country came to be, and how there's not much tolerance as well as deeply rooted animosities that are just below the surface of so-called Malaysian society. Most of modern Malaysia is of European settlement, but prior to European exploration as well as colonialism in Malaysia, most knowledge of what is now considered to be Malaysia as well as interactions were in and about the Malay Peninsula. Despite prehistorical evidence of human settlement within modern Borneo that roughly goes back 40,000 years, human settlement and knowledge of modern Malaysia dates back to roughly 3,000 to 7,000 years before the Common Era. The settlement on the Malay Peninsula were of overwhelming Hindu and Indian-based origin due to the proximity of the peninsula to the Indian subcontinent, as well as the presence of Indian culture, language, and even intermarriage permeated within the region for hundreds or if thousands of years. One of the oldest empires which still has evidence of its existence, which survived to modern times, is that of the Srivijaya Empire, which was of Indian origin. Roughly in the 1300s, when Muslim influence first came to the peninsula, this influence will come to later dominate Malaysian society. When the British first established colonies within the region, there were no real intentions of unifying them into a single colony or nation, as that's what's now considered to have been a defining feature of modern Malaysia. But in truth, each colony had its own individualistic customs, culture, and all relating to the native peoples living within them, as the only real aspect of unification were the underlying British colonial yoke, keeping everything together by either political coercion or military force. Due to the British annexing lands from different regional powers into their colonies, as well as after the Second World War, when all of the British colonies later consolidated together into what's now considered modern Malaysia, the country has sea border and land border disputes with Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Due to the circumstances of the establishment or proclamation of Malaysia, relations between the country and its neighbors have been at times tumultuous or even contentious, as well with multiple standoffs having occurred through these land and sea borders, as well as the boundaries being heavily disputed with other nations. And despite official claims by Malaysia that the country has peaceful diplomatic ties with other nations, this is not true. And due to these international disagreements, Malaysia retained and often shares deep political as well as diplomatical ties with the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and Australia. When the country now known as Malaysia was being formed, there were discussions about what to name the country. The term Malaya or Malaysia was a broad definition for island Southeast Asia, which comprised of the modern nations of the Philippines and Indonesia. One of the rumors as to how exactly they came about, the name or title came about, is that the term Malaysia is actually a combination of prefixes used to address the Malay region, which it was originally known as prior to European colonization. Malaya being that of the Indo-Malay people, which were the original peoples of the region, as well as the Ya, which is a Latin or Greek term to essentially turn it into Malaysia, which is the land of the Malay people. But since the Malay people are a significant amount of the population, this was considered highly controversial at the time, because the most politically active and well-known representation of the peoples within Malaysia are the Chinese, whose ancestors were brought to Malaya by the British for various labor. Another theory expanding upon the Malaya connection that it had the Shi, which was included to highlight the inclusion of Singapore, Borneo, and Sarawak. So with all of these combined meant a literal Malaysia. Malaysia. Indonesia, which is an English definition of the Greek term Indos, and Nesos for Indian islands. The Philippines, which is an English translation of a Spanish colonial term for the islands, Las Islas Filipinas, which was to honor Philip II of Spain. Both Indonesia and the Philippines have a more politically, socially, historically, as well as ethnically correct claim to the title or national term of Malaysia, due to both countries having a large as well as dominant Indo-Malay population and more of a historical connection with the title. But since the British colonies of Malaya appropriated the name first, nothing can be done about it in the modern sense. Even with modern Malaysia, the Chinese are of the upper class and control a vast amount of political as well as social forms of power within the country. The situation has never been resolved due to that same political and social structure of the country, as there have been multiple claims by Malayan governmental officials who have made public statements that if the country were to ever dissolve or collapse, then the Chinese within the country will be the demographic group to experience violence towards them by the other ethnicities within the country of Malaysia. As a result of the claims, the Chinese within Malaysia sought to further consolidate their power, as well as exert more influence within the country, as Malaysian citizens of mainland Chinese origin have often kept relations with the Chinese government in an attempt to protect themselves should the country ever face political or social instability. Whatever the fate of modern Malaysia, it would be observed very closely by its neighboring countries, as well as the circumstances upon looking back for its formation.